Can you actually increase the number of color phase bears in your area? And what about bears walking across open areas during the daylight? And do I have a favorite lure or bait? And what about ground blinds for bears? These are the topics we're going to be talking about in today's video. Thanks for joining me. Just real quick before I dive into this, I want to remind you that I'm going to be doing some live editions of the Bear Professor answering your questions at the Black Bear Show in Minnesota on July 25 to 27 this year. So go to blackbearshow.com. I'll leave a link also in the description below. It's going to be a really fun weekend of all kinds of vendors and seminars and campfires. It's like a weekend rendezvous for bear hunters. Come and camp if you want, or just come for the day, but some of the seminars are going to be question and answer sessions live and in person, so you can ask your questions face to face. First question we have today is about ground blinds. And the question is, do bears tear down ground blinds? Are ground blinds good or bad? Do they get used to them, or do you need to set them up each time, or set them up way ahead of time? I did an entire video on ground blinds, but I'm going to hit the highlights here because this is a question that comes up quite a bit. So first of all, my biggest issue that I have with ground blinds is that you don't get a low exit wound if you're hunting with a bow or a crossbow, and so you typically don't have as good of a blood trail to follow. With a rifle, shotgun, or whatever, that's generally not a problem because you're shooting level and you can make a good shot from a ground blind typically, but without a low exit wound, a lot of times you'll have very little blood trail, sometimes no blood trail at all if you're shooting them with an arrow. So that can be an issue. The other thing that's good is that a ground blind helps contain your scent. You can run a thermocell in there and control the mosquitoes. You can get away with a little bit more movement if you got it real nice and dark in there. But most bears are a little bit put off by a ground blind. They kind of don't like it there. So you really do have to put it up ahead of time. And another issue with ground blinds is it takes a pretty big space to put the thing up, and then you got to cut a lot more brush between you and the bait because you're level with the ground. If you're 15, 18 feet up in a tree, you're shooting over most of the brush, and so a ground blind can be very invasive. I've seen bears that just don't pay any attention to them. I've seen bears that just walk up and look in them, and I've also seen bears that are really put off by them. I've seen bears that act very nervous because of them. I really believe in brushing it in really good, and I've got this one ground blind that I've used quite a bit, and it's got two holes where you can see out of and shoot out of, and I've noticed that in the trail camera pictures the bears are looking at the blind so much, and I'm like, what is it about this blind that's bothered them? So I went and I stood at the bait and I looked back at the ground blind, and this blind literally looks like it's got two great big black eyes looking at you. When I buy another ground blind, I'm going to keep that in mind, that I think it really bothers them that it looks like eyes that are looking at them. So I really had to brush it in and break up the outline of those holes in order for the bears to be comfortable there. So yes, ground blinds have their place. In some places it's the only tool for the job basically, or maybe isn't even a tree that you can hang a tree stand in the right place for the bait. But in general, I kind of stay away from them for bow hunters. Okay, if you could pick one bait and one scent, what would that be? I'll say straight up, I would not want to pick one scent, and especially one bait, because I know that a variety of baits can be the best bet for attracting bears and holding them and keeping them. You all know that I like pastries and I like trail mix, and I'd hate to give up either one of those because the sweets are really good for getting bears to keep coming back right away, and then the trail mix is really good for keeping them through the long term. They come for the sweets and they get hooked because of the sweets, but if you want to keep them for weeks at a time, the trail mix works really good. Peanuts, sunflower seeds, granola, those are baits that consistently work over the long time. So if I had to choose just one bait, I guess, and hopefully this never happens, I'd pick a bait that's a trail mix with quite a bit of like dried fruit and maybe M&Ms, or it's got quite a bit of sweets mixed in with it. I guess if I had to pick one scent, that would be an easier choice, because the Northwoods Bear Products Gold Rush is so good for opening up a bait. It starts a bait off just super good. I use it on every one of my baits, and it gets bears on the baits really faster than just about anything you can think of. And then they also have a spray that's called Gold Mist, and it's this same smell. It's sort of it's like a mixture of butterscotch and caramel, kind of. In fact, if you think about the Werther's hard candy, that's what it smells like to me. So if I had to pick one, it would be the Gold Rush and then a Gold Mist spray that I can keep hitting the bait with every time I come back. But I do like the fruit smells, and I pretty much use blueberry, raspberry, cherry, and things like that in the fall, and I tend to go with more of the beaver castor and that type of scents in the spring. I've heard you say that bears do not like to walk across open areas during the daylight, but I have seen them feeding out in an oats field and alfalfa in broad daylight. So do some bears just not care about being in open areas? Okay, this is a good question, because I maybe haven't explained this as well as I could have. First of all, every time that I've said that black bears do not like to cross open areas in the daylight when they're approaching a bait. And that's very different than when they're just feeding out in a field or something like that, because their attitude is completely different when they're approaching a bait. Think of it sort of as if they're stalking a bait and they're trying to keep to cover, and they have a completely different attitude if they're just out feeding in the oats or the corn in the daylight. I think you can always keep in mind that bears just know when they're coming to a bait that it's a dangerous place to be. So when I say that they don't like to cross open areas during the daylight, that's specifically when they're approaching a bait, if you see what I mean. It's a big difference than if they're just feeding out during the day, or even traveling during the day and going no place in particular. Can you increase the number of color-phased bears by not shooting the color ones? For example, if you have some blonde bears in your area, are they the ones passing on the blonde genes? And this is really a complicated question, and the answer to it is nobody really knows for sure. But here's the thing you have to keep in mind. So obviously a blonde bear, you know that it has the blonde bear genes. But if you see a black bear standing right beside it, you don't know if that bear might have the blonde bear genes too. Because in an area where color phases are prevalent, you could have two black bears that breed and have two blonde cubs. Or you can have a blonde bear that has one black cub and one blonde cub and one cinnamon cub. And there's no way to know for sure if those cubs are all fathered by the same male. Because of delayed implantation, sows can breed with several males, and different eggs can be fertilized by different males, and she can literally have 3 or 4 cubs that could be by all the same male or by different males. So I guess theoretically, if you see a cinnamon bear, you know that it has a color phase genes. You see a blonde bear, you know that it has a color phase gene. So if you don't shoot the color phases, theoretically you could be increasing the number of color phase bears, but there's really no way to be sure. So as far as I know, nobody's really done any detailed research on the genetics of color phases. If you know of any, I'd sure like to hear about it, because I'm fascinated by this subject, and you probably are too. Have you considered doing a regular podcast? I think it would be very popular. I have considered it. I've been on quite a few podcasts. I've had a lot of people have invited me to be on podcasts, and I think that's what I'm going to stick with at this time. I don't know that I want to really get set up for podcasts. I suppose it's possible you could change my mind, and I'll just stick with YouTube for right now, but I wouldn't rule it out for some point in the future. Keep the questions coming. There's quite a few people that have said they like this segment of this channel, so I'll keep doing it. If you keep asking the questions, just drop something in the comment section below. And thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next video.